meeting. Okay, so now it is recording. All right. So sounds like a really interesting idea. I didn't realize that this was a thing in avant-garde theorizing. And as soon as I started to look around, I thought, wow, there's all this material. Now, it sounds like you're trying to sort of frame this object of study in something that is both fairly clear, but also very flexible, right? And that's more, as you point out, that's more of a poetics. So the first thing I want to point out, and I'm just going to hold up, this is Dictionary of Literary Terms by Chris Baldick, and on page, page 262, he talks about poetics, and it pretty well sounds like the way you've described it. The general principles of poetry or of literature in general, in this case, it could be gaming, it could be film, it could be television, or the theoretical study of these principles. As a body of theory, poetics is concerned with the distinctive features of poetry or literature as a whole, or literally anything else you can drop into it, with its languages, forms, genres, and modes of composition. So a theorist of poetry or literature may be called a poetician. See also aesthetics and criticism, which of course they fall under. So it seems that it's concerned with the specific or distinctive features of the object of study and trying to find sort of common traits between all of them. So that's the first one. All right. Now the second one here, it's another one from Oxford, Dictionary of Critical Theory. And this is kind of the one that moves us into the terrain that will yield, I think, some really interesting ideas, because as you've already pointed out, the aesthetic object, right, the cute puppy or the fun object, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It exists in an interaction between a person and an object, and that person's history, that person's subjectivity, what they consider, beautiful or ugly, good or bad, and so on, but all of it in this kind of social context. So here, page 369, Ian Buchanan says, poetics, the study of the formal construction of literary works of all genres, not just poetry. So now we've already moved beyond literature and poetry. It is underpinned by the assumption that it is possible to delineate what it is that separates a poetic or literary use of language from a non-poetic ordinary use of language. In contrast to Russian formalism, which is an obvious precursor, it is not primarily concerned with the problems of determining which is literary and which is not. Rather, its concern is with the effectivity and unity of specific literary works. Poetics is often treated as a synonym for structuralist literary theory. Now, yes, on the surface, but as we talked about a few weeks ago, when we deal with structuralist issues, we're completely devoid of history, right? We're devoid of society, devoid of the subject, devoid of all of the messiness, right, in which this object, we encounter it. So be really careful when someone says, it's kind of like structuralism. Look carefully to see if it is. On the surface, it appears to be, because we're looking for certain traits and characteristics of a body of work. I did back in the 1980s, I did a kind of a structuralist analysis of films put out by the National Film Board regarding immigration. And at the time, I was under the absolute sway of structuralist thinking. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And it was really helpful because it allowed me to look for traits, right? Characteristics in terms of content, in terms of style or structure. And I was able to bring it down to basically 4 main ideas. But in so doing, it completely removed the individual context of each film. It removed the history of the film, when it occurs, because as I point out elsewhere in the same article, things begin changing in the 1960s, especially the early 1970s, in terms of immigration policies in Canada. And the last sort of character that we see is the idea of the refugee. Now, refugees came out, after World War II, came over to Canada, and then they seemed to sort of die off. Well, the refugees in the 1970s are coming from not developed nations, but developing nations. So there's a whole history behind that of the refugee. But when I look at that article now, I realize that, oh, we see this character, but again, completely stripped of its history, of its subjectivity, of its historical context, and so on. So poetics, as you point out, needs to be both sort of identifying those particular bits of content, but still fairly flexible, right? That it can sort of move and the ebb and flow of the context in which that object appears. So that is certainly a very good idea. Now, you did mention having a look at this book here, right? The Poetics of Postmodernism. And so again, a lot of really useful information. I know this book came out in 1984 or something like that, but I still refer to it because I think 1988. So not too bad. I still find it to be a really useful book because it really breaks down exactly that, what you're trying to do. In page 4, right, I offer a specific, if polemical start from which to operate. It's a cultural activity. Well, they're right off the bat, right? We're not dealing with structuralism, devoid of history and society, but quite the opposite. This idea of a poetics is part of a cultural activity that can be discerned in most art forms and many currents of thought today. What I want to call postmodernism. It's fundamentally contradictory, resolutely historical, and inescapably political. Okay, so right here, page 4, literally within a few pages, there's a clear indication that when we talk about a poetics of postmodernism, it can't by its very nature be confined to simply pieces of art, right? Or films or television or whatever. There's a whole range of secondary issues that need to be considered. So taking that approach and coming up with a poetics of cuteness, absolutely crucial, absolutely the right way to go. Now, the next one I pulled up here was this one here, and we'll start noticing that there are some similarities, right? Different thinkers at different times say essentially the same thing. Excuse me. All right, so this is from this book here, The Challenge of Surrealism. And there's a really wonderful essay at the beginning by Elizabeth Lenk, who corresponded with Adorno in the 1960s and 70s regarding surrealism. And that in itself is rather interesting because Adorno had given up on surrealism, thinking that it was essentially just a dead issue. Whatever revolutionary impetus or influence it may have had basically played itself out. And as however outrageous or revolutionary they may have been, they just basically ended up spinning the wheels and creating just more and more the same thing. There was no actual kind of dialectical movement towards something new. And so here's Adorno thinking this way. And in that case, not unlike Debord and the SI, because they viewed surrealism in much the same way. So this is a letter that Elizabeth Lenk wrote to Adorno in October of 1967. And she talks about Breton. She talks about Nadja, right, which is the story that I wanted to have a look at. And she says, I call Breton's particular view of reality poetic materialism, a materialism that has nothing to do with philosophical or historical materialisms, but has the exact location only in poetry. Materialism is the idea that the body of work creates the very first sense, the way it inadvertently moves towards the human body and what it can bring forth in terms of a thought, a rhythm. Okay, so now we're starting to focus in on what is going to be kind of rich in terms of defining that poetics is the subjective interaction between the viewer or player of the game and the object itself. And in that sense, it can be a kind of poetic materialism. You mentioned in your notes, for example, a cuddly toy, right? That tactile feeling that is just very soft and plushy. That's poetic materialism. It is the tactile feeling of this thing in your hand. Okay, material is word material, and Breton has the alchemical notion that it can be purged of its sensual dross. The material in which pure qualities appear is glass, the element of modernity that surpasses water. All this because I'm only giving a vague idea of it. May perhaps sound obscure. However, it is neither preconceived notion nor mere working hypothesis, but something that is embedded in the texts themselves. I simply hadn't seen it before. So in thinking about the object and in thinking about the relationship that the viewer or player, the possessor of the object, therein lies something rather interesting, right? It's not only tactile and material, it exists in space, it exists either in someone's room or on their phone, but there's something about that object that brings forth a kind of awareness of the human being being the one that is responding to it. The aesthetic, I guess the aesthetic feeling is not necessarily in the object, it's the feeling is in the response of the viewer, the subject. So subjectivity, I think, is really a crucial aspect of what that poetics may sound like. And that seems to be something that we start seeing more and more of. Oh, hang on a second. I'm just going to close this door. There. So we start seeing more and more of this in the ideas that I'm kind of presenting to you. And again, it carries on. This is a book by Günther Anders. Whoops, right here. So Human Artifice for a Negative Anthropology. Whoops, right there. Günther Anders. I don't know how much material has been translated by or not by him, but on him. But this is a very brief little bit about what he calls historical man, right? Historical individuals. And he talks about the fact that, okay, so l'homme de l'or profondément engagé. Okay, so the man individuals are profoundly engaged in this idea of antinomy that is effectively non-historical. It's at the very base, something that is accidental, because the event in rapport to the kind of constancy of one's life is attempting to continue on. So what he's arguing here is history becomes a series of kind of discrete, unrelated events. It tries to do that, but we, as we kind of intercept this discrete structure by simply existing, we have a past, right? We have a present, we have a future. So he says here, the weird relationship that we have with history, it exists as if it is a discrete set of events that are not connected. History isn't. Absolutely, it is not. So the idea is that we carry around in our heads our own history. And sometimes, as you kind of hint in your ideas on this paper, there is this paradox between history that is lived outside of ourselves and in the history that is suddenly, we are reminded of something when we see an object either from our childhood or something that reminds us of a different time, usually a better time. And typically childhoods tend to be better. So right there is not an unawareness of history, but quite the opposite. History is not a discrete thing. I'm right now living in the past, seeing this object. And it happens whenever I see, like an old, I don't know, a TV show or something, or a movie I last saw 40 years ago. I'm brought back to that moment. So I may be living right now today in 2023, but my headspace is 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And I'm not sure whether that might be something you wish to explore. The fact that this notion of history is a series of discrete events clearly are not. They are not. They're more a series of events that may follow one another. But we don't live this way. Our ability to switch back and forth to past to present, consider the future, really allows us to break free of this relationship that history tries to present to us of the way it unfolds. Yes, it does, but we can remember, right? I mean, when you think of all these, the poppies, right? The poppies that people are going to wear on November 11th, right? Never forget. Okay, we never forget. And that poppy is a little object that reminds us of the sacrifices that people have made. Now, it's not something cute or cuddly. It's something quite, serious and respectful. But it seems to do the same thing. It reminds people of a previous time that we can conjure up very easily in our minds. So I'm wondering was that something you wanted to explore in your poetics?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It seems, yeah, like cuteness as something brings us back to like memory of childhood.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. That seems to be an interesting direction, and I never heard of this book, but the title Artifice of
Yeah,
Humanity?
it's
I'm not sure.
yeah.
Yes. Um, Negative.
Now
Yeah, I
he has a whole bunch of various ideas, and they're kind of really interesting nuggets. I just wish there was more information, not more information, but more of his books available other than French. Even though he's German, it just seems that the French really like him. So his work has been translated into French, but not into English. So there you go. But he says, it's the paradox of the historical period we live in and the history that we exist in, right? Like our lived past, right? Our lived presence as well. And he says, yeah, the historical man, nous ne pouvons pas le concevoir. So we can't be a fugitive from it. We need to insert ourselves into history. But at the same time, there is this attempt by history to present itself as somehow discreetly unconnected with those things which have happened previously. And we, because we're not robots, can do that. And that makes us, rather interesting characters. Now, the childhood part, I think, is also interesting here because I, of course, went to Adorno's aesthetic theory. Now, some of these books I actually have links to. So when I send the next email, I'll have those in there because there's a lot of material, like in this book especially. Take it in small chunks, though, because it's also quite thick. It's 400 and something, 500 pages. But not all of it is relevant. Lots of interesting stuff. But in here, Adorno does talk about some things that I think are really, really worth considering. Excuse me. Yeah, getting through this. Okay. So the first thing here, this is on page 60, and the little section is called "On the Relationship" or on our relation to traditional art. And he says, authentic art of the past may have had to hide its face for the time being, but it is not condemned forever just because of that. Great works are in a state of waiting. While their metaphysical meaning is gone, they retain an element of their truth content, an element that is difficult to identify. And so it sounds like that's kind of where we're at right now, where we know that there is something that is compelling about an object that we might consider quote unquote cute. So right now, what we're trying to do is define what it is, not necessarily the object, but the relationship we have to the object. And I think this is, for Adorno, what he's more concerned with, because when he talks about aesthetic theory, it's about art and society, right? The work of art in a given society, and of course in a capitalist society. So that's very important. But he says, this element that is difficult to identify. Typically, art kind of can be reductive at times. Here's a picture of a tree, but the kind of art that the SI was making, for example, was much more confrontational and much more disturbing. Not disturbing in a cheap way, but disturbing in a way that you continue looking at it and considering it and thinking about it and mulling it over. Well, good art should disturb. And here we're not talking about disturbing art, but art that kind of does something the opposite. It's a very positive feeling. And we have to ask ourselves, why am I drawn to this cuddly toy? Why am I drawn to this, this wonderful anime that I really love? Because it reminds me of my childhood. It reminds me of something that is ephemeral, something that may not be in the object itself, but lies in the relationship between the object and the subject who's viewing it. I think that's kind of what Adorno is trying to describe here. Okay, and then here is, again, these wonderful nuggets from Adorno. This is on page 64, and the section here is section 23 on solipsism, mimetic taboo, and maturity. And he ends that section with the following: the irrationality of the principle of reason, as evidenced in its fetishization of means, is unmasked by art with its overt irrationality. The fact that art can disturb, right? It is a means to an end. Good art can disturb, unmasked by art with its overt irrationality, which nonetheless is based on rational modes of doing things. Art is created in a certain way. There's certain rules and regulations we need to follow. But he says this: art brings out the childish aspects in the ideal of being an adult. I think that would be the first line in your paper, because every once in a while Adorno is absolutely clear in his feelings about whatever it is he's talking about. But there it is. Art brings out the childish aspects in the ideal of being an adult, the capacity that we have to think back to a childhood, think back to a certain period of time, and in enjoying aesthetically that object, we enjoy it in a childlike way, right? Not childish, but childlike, with a sense of wonder, a sense of bliss, a sense of positive feelings. So I think that particular line might be something that is certainly worth considering in terms of how this poetics of cuteness will really become workable, because depending on what the object is, these rules will be able to sort of work their way around that object with a degree of flexibility. Because again, it's you're absolutely correct in saying a poetics rather than a theory of, because all of a sudden the first thing that happens, something gets introduced to that undermines the theory. It doesn't fit. So here, a poetics, the childish feelings that it brings out, or childlike feelings, I think are really important. Then it goes on here. Again, this is aesthetic theory we're looking at. This is another chapter here, section 6 of this one. This is on page 103. Okay, so he says, adequate knowledge of aesthetic matters is the spontaneous recapitulation of objective processes taking place in the work owing to the tensions therein. Okay, so the tensions are the analytic reflection. This is a work of art. This is a toy. This is a video game. I understand what this is. I'm supposed to respond in a certain fashion, in a certain way. And so he says, a recapitulation of objective processes taking place in the work owing to the tensions therein. In general terms, and here we speculate, aesthetic behavior seems to be an outgrowth of exposure to natural beauty in childhood. So there's another sort of reframing of the art object as something that conjures up a past feeling, a past life. And again, this relationship to childhood, and how quite often the aesthetic enjoyment of a piece of art may actually lie in a positive viewpoint of childhood. Now, not every single person is lucky enough to have an idyllic childhood, and we can only wish that everyone could experience that. But here, there's this notion that aesthetic behavior, which is the response that a person has to an object of art or object of video or film, is an outgrowth of something that originally began with that childlike wonderment of just the world, right? The wow factor. Or the opposite, that's something that just felt really nice. Kids go to sleep with teddy bears, or they go to sleep with, fluffy toys. And that sense of security, that sense of, of comfort, all those things now suddenly start returning, right? And it is a way to identify where one is at a certain point in their lives and in where they were before. And I think here that aesthetic behavior should at least include, like it says here we speculate, but I think in this case, this would be, again, a really good starting point. This notion that our ideas of natural beauty go all the way back to childhood. All right. And again, because this book is so thick and it's full of really interesting things, again, he talks about modes of behavior, right? Aesthetic behavior. And here in this section, the very beginning of chapter 10, which is on page 253, he talks about modes of behavior in terms of the viewer or player and the object. The manner therein art constitutes an existence is a dynamic mode of behavior, an orientation towards objectivity, which does three things. It steps back from objectivity, it takes up a stance towards it, and in so doing, it preserves some version of it. Artworks synthesize diverse, incompatible moments. They alone search for a true identity of the identical and the non-identical in terms of process. True because that identity is only a moment, childhood, for example, and not some magic formula for the whole. The dynamic quality of art is grounded in the fact that they are man-made artifacts. As such, they belong by definition to the native realm of spirit. But in order to be identical with themselves, they need the presence of the heterogeneous, the non-identical, the amorphous. And again, we're back into this sort of not clearly defined relationship. There's always something left outside of what would be sort of a structuralist analysis of either our relationship to something or what the object contains. It sounds like in your work, you clearly want to include the viewer, right, the subject, as part of your poetics. And so when I read this, that's kind of what it makes me think of. Okay, so then we go on in page 330. He talks about how art is a type of praxis, and there's no need to make apologies for its failures to act directly. Art could not do so, even if it wanted to. Surely the political impact, even of so-called committed art, is highly uncertain. The political position artists may play a role in defining their standpoint in relation to the prevailing consciousness. But when it comes to the growth of their work, these positions have little importance. And then he talks about, in the very next line, how Mozart didn't think much of the French Enlightenment. Does that change our opinion about, his Requiem or, his Serenade for Strings or whatever? No, it's kind of irrelevant. So he says, periodically art may fail, but it kind of begs the question, what was it trying to do, right? If art is a kind of praxis, which is, thoughtful activity, perhaps a thoughtful activity for someone to create what would be a cuddly or cute piece of art, was that their own intention? Or was that something that they imbued into that object because to them, right, specifically to them, this thing meant, something quite important. And we may be lucky to participate in that same feeling. I don't know if you've ever made art before. I've made music, I've made films, I've written a few bits of poetry. And once that object is done and you put it out into the world, you're no longer responsible for interpretations. It just happens. I've made a couple of experimental films that once I showed them in public, I had people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, it was about this and this and this poor little boy." And what? It was remarkable how people they would view something, it would conjure up all these different feelings and thoughts and histories that they had, simply just a parade of images. So the cultural experience that person has had, right, the cultural and emotional baggage that they have, absolutely will impact the aesthetic pleasure that person has in relation to the object that they're experiencing. And to try to think otherwise is really, it's pretty difficult, because I can't imagine it happening, because I've had personal experience in that. Someone was telling me what my film made, what it was about, and no, it wasn't. But you know what? I'm glad you enjoyed it, because that's kind of the way what happens. Okay, and then the last one here from Adorno. This is on page 453, and he talks about here, it's kind of a long sentence, but he talks about how in the eyes of the existing rationality, so this is capitalist rationality, commodification of art, art as product, art as as an end point, not a means to something. And I think the cuddly toy may be more of a means to something else. So he says, in the eyes of the existing rationality, aesthetic behavior is irrational because it castigates the particularity of this rationality in its pursuit, not of ends, but of means. Art keeps alive the memory of ends-oriented reason, but it also keeps alive the memory of a kind of objectivity that lies beyond conceptual frameworks. So here he's talking about how art can not only conjure up, but it can also allow to continue a certain memory that a person may have that was initially sort of triggered by the art object. These days, we talk about trigger words, right? Trigger words that will set people off. I think here in this kind of context of talking about art and society, Adorno is describing something similar, obviously not words, but images, certain kinds of content that will trigger a memory in an individual that could be positive or negative. But that's the part that escapes rationality, isn't it? Because the end result is a piece of art, but the response that the piece of art expects from the viewer, which is in a capitalist society is, I like that. It matches my couch. I think I'm going to buy it, as opposed to, there's just something about this toy that I just love. It just makes me feel good, and it feels good in my hands. I get it, but when we're describing that, we absolutely need to keep that subject, the viewing subject, the engaging subject, absolutely in our perimeter. Otherwise, I think it would make writing these kinds of things really, really difficult at the very least. Okay, so that is what I wanted to sort of pull out. I've got a couple of other things. Now, where it ties into the SI, and I'm going to quote here from my book. This is from chapter 1. And I think what you're looking at is remarkably similar to what the symbolists actually went through. And so I make the argument that the SI, excuse me, the SI in some of their aesthetic strategies really kind of followed the same trajectory as the French symbolists. So in chapter 1, it says, in this chapter, we will examine a connection with 19th century French literary history that has not often been discussed or acknowledged in literature on or about the SI. But referring to the possibility that SI aesthetic practices regarding poetic language have their genesis in the French symbolist poetry of Baudelaire, Lautréamont, Rimbaud, and Mallarmé. For poet and art critic Jean Mauriac, writing in Le Figaro in 1886, right? So the symbolist period is kind of in its twilight at this point, writes in 1886, quote, symbolist poetry seeks to clothe the idea with a sensitive form, which nevertheless would not be its goal in itself, but which, while serving to express the idea, would remain subject. The idea, in its turn, must not allow itself to be deprived of external analogies, for the essential character of symbolic art consists in never going so far as to conceive of the idea in itself. So it's almost like there are two parallel moments that are occurring. One is the in this case, we're going to be talking about the art object. Here, these are poets. So a certain word that conjures up both a kind of said and an unsaid. And the fact that you're clothing the idea in an object, just because, a ship is sailing off into the distance, or there's a boat going down a river and moving every which way, the fact that the symbolist poet catches their attention. Well, what were they thinking at the moment? That particular very specific image caught something in their mind that is representative. The problem is the symbolists don't tell us what the idea is. So it is up to us to read through the poems and think of what perhaps had been that initial thought that went into that poet's mind when they saw this one moment in the world, right? This a certain color raincoat walking by a certain color wall at this certain part of the day. All of a sudden, oh, it reminds me of this. And we can think of, in our everyday world, that happens quite often. We'll see, we'll hear a sound, we'll see a color combination. It triggers memories in us. But the symbolists really made this into an art form because they're able to close the idea that itself would not be otherwise considered if that image, that piece of content had not existed. And so I go on. The reason why this connection is worth investigating is because situationists share the following perspectives with some symbolists, not all of them, but some symbolist poets. A burgeoning social consciousness developed alongside aesthetic innovations, a progressive attitude towards social and political issues, and the romantic attitude of the lone individual standing against the authoritarianism of capitalist industrial society. Now, what's important here is, I'll just read the rest of it and we'll go back to it. So right after I say, historian Charles Russell, on the other hand, argues that the mid-19th century represents the moment at which the artist suddenly becomes aware of their alienation over and against the dominant values of the bourgeois culture. For its part, the SI argues that alienation certainly does exist, but that bourgeois culture itself will become the site of transformative resistance for one important dialectical reason, because culture is a center of meaning in a society without meaning. This empty culture is at the heart of an empty existence. And the reinvention of a project of transforming the world as a whole must also, and first of all, be posed on this terrain. So what happens is, and that whole page is a couple of things. One is the fact that the symbolists are aware of a certain feeling, right? This feeling of alienation. But the way to describe it, you would think that they were considering like the lone, the rugged individual, the person who stands out from the crowd, the philosopher that Nietzsche talked about, the philosopher that as you begin to discuss society, you find yourself at odds with it. And so the symbolists, in trying to understand the world as it was changing, because it was becoming increasingly modernized because of industry and the gradual seeping down of capitalism into literally everyday life, that sense of alienation of the values that accompanied capitalism versus the values that had accompanied French culture are increasingly at odds, right? They're literally disconnected from one another. And as much as the poetry talks about feelings of being disconnected, what they're describing is alienation. They just don't have the word for it, right? The word alienation comes along much later, even though Marx talks about it. He talks about it in terms of just, the alienated worker in the factory. At that time, individuals were only just beginning to feel, but they were beginning to feel something that they were trying to find the words for. And it turns out that the alienation that was indicative of industrialization in the factory, the way that Marx saw it, it was now gradually seeping out into the world at large. So society at large was becoming increasingly alienating. So what I'm trying to talk about here is the way in which the symbolists were able to use literally any object that they thought was representative of something that they hadn't quite found the words for just yet. So poetically, and visually, in conjuring up these images, the poetry they were writing was poetry of alienation without it being called just that. And that's the part that kind of escapes the actual words, because they do certainly conjure up ideas. And now we have the advantage of hindsight, and we go back and look at things written in the 1860s, 1870s, Baudelaire in particular, and we can feel those, that sense of alienation, but never explicitly said. And that's why Moria says, it's an idea that's clothed and almost hidden behind the content, the object. But the idea in this case was, being alienated from each other, from society, from, French cultural values. But there it is being described, and we can see it as we read it 150 years later. So I wanted to point that out. Let's see. Okay, now another book here. As much as this is Durkheim, The Rules of Sociological Method. Now, why did I pull this thing out? Because I was also reading this book, right? I think you mentioned this one, Cultural Politics of Emotions. And it reminded me of why I keep going back to Durkheim, because he talks about in here what he considers to be a social fact. And so in the chapter called What is a Social Fact, he says, here then is a category of facts which present very special characteristics. They consist of manners of acting, thinking, and feeling external to the individual, which are invested with a coercive power by virtue of which they exercise control over him. Consequently, since they consist of representations and actions, they cannot be confused with organic phenomena, in other words, from within, not with psychic phenomena, the mental capacity, which have no existence save in and through the individual consciousness. So it seems to be a collective issue, which makes it a social fact. Thus, they constitute a new species, and to them must be exclusively assigned the term social. So these are social facts because they affect individuals slightly differently, but they affect everyone. So either political society in its entity or entirety, or one of the partial groups that it includes, religious dominations, political literary schools, corporate occupations. So a social fact, whatever is in the air at the time, he says, essentially, a social fact is one, manners and thoughts external to the individual, 2, invested with coercive power, 3, consisting of representations and actions that are collective, that we all participate in because we have a cultural memory, we have individual memories, and in the end, they become collecting ways of being. So collective ways of thinking, of being, of assessing the world. And so imagine within this kind of world of social facts that, exert a gentle but firm pressure to think a certain way about the world, along comes this object, which on the surface seems to be just kind of a throwaway thing. It's just a fluffy object. All of a sudden now, we are reminded not only of history wishing us to think in a certain way, and in that social fact, that gentle pressure of the social fact, because it is coercive, suddenly we start realizing that, oh, yeah, I'm still an individual, right? This object is speaking to me directly. Something is compelling me to consider it, right? Think about it, hold it in my hands, rub my face against it, whatever it may be. So Durkheim just always has these interesting ways of seeing the world, which I think help us in designing a poetics or designing a framework into which we can look at these things. Again, what I did in the back here, and I know we can see it, but that's typically what I do is I'll read the book and I'll make all my this is the entire book in one page. But I wanted to just present this idea of a social fact. Adorno talks a little bit about the same thing. There's a certain expectation of the viewer, the aesthetic, the aesthetic viewer, to enjoy something in a certain way, right? There's a gentle pressure to just stand back and collectively look at it and go, just like Kant, oh, lovely contemplation, it's very nice. But how many people want to go and, put their hands on the Mona Lisa as opposed to, pick up a fluffy toy? It just begs to be picked up, right? It just begs to be held, because this seems to be the kind of overall quality of its beauty is its tactile quality, right? That becomes a little art object that goes above and beyond it simply being a pure object. It's something that wants to interact with you. I don't think there was really anything else in here. Classify societies according to the degree of organizations and so on and so on. Okay, but I wanted to just point out this idea of the social fact that's sort of Durkheim's way of saying, expectations that are placed on people to behave in certain ways. Of course, he was writing this at the turn of the last century. Things have changed a little bit, and we are expecting, of course, more and more now that capitalism is seeped into the art world. We're expected to behave in a certain way. Objective contemplation, which is Kant, and then now we need to go further, and now we're going to purchase this thing. So all these ideas, I think, are really important and worth considering, because they are, they're part of the way in which we're going to try to design this poetics to be both flexible and, a tool by which we can identify something that would be considered cute, right, quote unquote. Now, are you familiar with this book at all, the Cultural Politics of Emotion?
Yeah, I only read some quotes from it from the Teddy Pozzo's article.
Okay.
Mhm.
Because in
Yeah,
the
when
in the very first section, and again, I don't want to read all the way through, but she starts by saying the everyday language of emotion is based on a presumption of interiority, the fact that emotions come from outside. And she says here, the logic is that I have feelings, which then move outwards toward the objects and others, and which then return to me. I call this the inside out model of emotions. And then proceeds to say, okay, well, that's one. But she says, now I'm going to use sociology and anthropology to argue that emotions should actually be considered as psychological states, but also as social and cultural practices. And it was here that I thought, oh yeah, right, Durkheim, and Durkheim's classic account of emotions. It is sociology in recognizing constraint, right? Just step back and just aesthetically contemplate. Don't get too excited. And then she says the sociological realm is defined, as the imposition of the without on the individual subject. So the social fact which floats around, this is beautiful, that is not, that is gorgeous, that is ugly, right? Those are the social facts that press down on us in terms of what our expectations should be of aesthetic pleasure. So the demarcation of the sociological becomes a theory of emotion as a social form, rather than individual self-expression. The individual is no longer the origin of feeling. Feeling itself comes from without, right? It is part of that social fact. Rather than emotions being understood as coming from within and moving outwards, emotions are assumed to come from without and move inward. So as an outside-in model, it is also evident in approaches to crowd psychology. Assume that a crowd has feelings. Individuals get drawn into crowds by feeling the crowd's feelings as its own. So the argument she's making here is that notions of emotions are often part of something that we all share, right? Those two can be social facts, and they become something that we need to consider as we are engaging aesthetically with that object. So because of that, I think that's what Sarah Ahmed is saying has some validity, because it is an emotional state that is conjured up with that object that defies sort of the expectations of the capitalist production of, object consumption or object product and consumption that way. It breaks that mold apart by reintroducing the subject into it. And not only that, asks the subject to consider themselves both in the present tense in front of this object, but also their childhood, also some of their individual histories as to why something would feel the way that it does. And why am I drawn to this one object? Okay, let's see. I've got two more books left in here. This one, I don't know if you've ever seen this one before, The Anti-Aesthetic, Essays on Postmodern Culture. Also another book, I think this one came out in 83. So it's kind of getting a little bit old, but once again, it has some really good information in it. Okay, so this one here, this is Art as a Critical Mirror. Now this is from this particular one. This was an article by Habermas, and he talks here about the surrealists, and what he says should line up very nicely with the ideas we've already discussed with the SI and surrealism. The surrealists waged the most extreme warfare, but two mistakes in particular destroyed their revolt. First, when the containers of an autonomously developed cultural sphere were shattered, the contents got dispersed. Nothing remains from a desublimated meaning or a destructured form. Anticipatory effects do not follow. The second mistake has even more important consequences. In everyday communication, cognitive meanings, moral expectations, subjective expressions, and evaluations must relate to each other. A rational everyday life could hardly be saved from cultural impoverishment through breaking open a singular cultural sphere, art, which is something that the SI actually were hoping to do. So Habermas would not have agreed with their ideas. And so providing access to just one of the specialized knowledge complexes, the surrealist revolt would have replaced only one abstraction. So a little bit in agreement with the SI, and also not. Where they're in agreement with, Habermas is saying that, that revolt would have only replaced one abstraction, art. And the SI had been arguing, no, we need to transcend art and make life artful and art part of life. So there is a little bit of that in Habermas, in his view of the way in which the surrealist revolt really kind of consumed itself. Because if you look at the history of the work, it became increasingly sort of individualized as artists sort of dug further and further within themselves. It became really kind of a sort of navel gazing, and some of these things were so specific to a single person that it was unable to transcend into kind of, that not popular culture, but that cultural realm. People can make art and, you put it out in the world, but if it is so specific and so part of that one person's existence, it becomes really hard to decipher it, because we look at it and we're not sure what it means because it's not speaking to us. So that's essentially what Habermas is arguing here in this case. Okay. The other issue here too, pluralism Okay. Postmodern works also very important. I'm trying to find here the one piece that is relevant. Okay, here we are. Okay, so this is the part, the kind of in postmodernism, there is what is called, or was called by Craig Owens, an anti-totalizing impulse. And I think in your poetics, you want to make sure that you're doing that, right? You're holding that totalizing impulse at bay, because you don't want this poetics to become something rigid. You wanted to give it some flexibility. So he says, okay, to claim that the divisions of the sexes are irreducible to the division of labor is to risk polarizing feminism and Marxism. The danger is real, given the latter's fundamentally patriarchal basis. So he talks about Marxism and its relationship to feminism, but what he's trying to do here is to keep it from totalizing to a single idea. What is at issue is not simply the oppressiveness of Marxist discourse. In other words, the notion of feminism is subsumed by Marxism. Marx says very little about women, and that's a given at this point. And that's what he's talking about. He says what is at issue is not simply the oppressiveness of Marxist discourse, but its totalizing ambitions, its claim to account for every single form of social existence. So the anti-totalizing impulse is something that is considered postmodern. It could be part of your poetics as well. Okay, and this one finally is moving into the last book I want to show you. And this is from, this is by Frederick Jameson, Postmodernism and Consumer Society. And this is on page 114, that he talks about the death of the subject. But now we need to introduce a new piece into this puzzle, which may help explain why classical modernism is a thing of the past and why postmodernism should have taken its place. This new component is what is generally called the death of the subject, or to say it in more conventional language, the end of individualism as such. The great modernisms were, as we have said, predicated on the invention of a personal, private style, as unmistakable as your fingerprint, as incomparable as your own body. But this means that the modernist aesthetic is in some way organically linked to the conception of a unique self and private identity, a unique personality and individuality, which can be expected to generate its own unique vision of the world and to forge its own unique, unmistakable style. So what he's discussing here is, in the postmodern world, everyone has a voice. Everyone can describe the unique visions, the unique take on the world, we'll say. But in so doing, we need to also be mindful that once it moves into the cultural realm, will it generate sense, right, and generate meaning to other people, which kind of was the downfall of surrealism, because of the fact that it was increasingly sort of myopic and navel-gazing. It eventually kind of lost its cultural mooring, right? It's mooring to society at large. So the end result becomes something that is maybe meaningful to one or two people, but not to a whole lot of other individuals, because these lived experiences are so specific. So postmodernism, you can try to express yourself because there are more and more voices being heard, but there is also at the same time the fact that what you create runs a risk of not being understood, right? The meanings are not generated. Now, the last thing I'll mention is the way in which we can salvage this. And I'm actually really, really happy that I finally get a chance to throw in Roland Barthes. Now, this is Le Plaisir du Texte, which is The Pleasure of the Text. Nice little 40-page book. And I have a link for you for it, because in it, what I did is I just photocopied a couple of sections out of it. And the contents are actually almost in alphabetical, or the contents, the sections, we'll say, are almost in alphabetical order. And so the first one I want to mention is on emotion, right? Which I think is also part of that poetics that you're trying to describe. And Barthes writes, and this is on page 25, emotion. Why should I be antipathetic to bliss? Right? Childhood, wonder, re-enchantment. Why should I be antipathetic to bliss? I was wrong when I used to see it wholly on the side of sentimentality or moral illusion. It is a disturbance, a bordering on collapse, something perverse, under respectable appearances, Emotion is even perhaps the slyest of the losses, for it contradicts the general rule that would assign bliss a fixed form, strong, violent, crude, something inevitably muscular, strained, phallic. Against the general rule, never allow oneself to be deluded by the image of bliss. Agree to recognize bliss whenever a disturbance occurs in the amatory adjustments, prematurely delayed, and so on. A passionate love is bliss, bliss as wisdom, when it manages to understand itself outside of its own prejudices. Now, Barthes writes very poetically, pushes the French language to its limits, but generally, he is thinking of emotion. Bliss is a kind of jouissance, right? A kind of pleasure, but he's tentatively, anchoring it into an emotional response, and is not quite sure whether that is something that would be considered. But hey, it's Barthes, right? So it's food for thought, even by way of a disagreement, because he says it is a disturbance bordering on collapse. Now, collapse of what, right? The aesthetic contemplation, because Kant kept arguing that good art was aesthetically beautiful. But how can beautiful not be a sort of emotion, right? That's the part that's really unusual. So that's the first one. The second one here is, I think, also an idea you might want to consider in thinking of the cuddly or the cute object is the notion of a fetish object. So here he's talking about writing, and he writes on page 27, the text is a fetish object, and this fetish desires me. The text chooses me by a whole disposition of invisible screens, selective baffles, vocabulary, references, readability, etc. And again, and here, cuddliness too, I think, is an important one. And lost in the midst of the text, not behind it, like a deus ex machina, there's always the other, the author. So in this case, the creator of this object, whatever it may be, lurks behind. I mean, lurks not in a negative way, but just is a kind of a phantom presence. But the fetish object, the object seems to call out to me, right? It seems to look for me rather than I for it. And so the text chooses me. My whole disposition of invisible screens, vocabulary and so on. So as an institution, the author is dead. His civil status, his biographical person has disappeared, dispossessed. They no longer exercise over the work the formidable paternity whose account literary history, teaching, and public opinions had the responsibility of establishing and renewing. But in the text, in a way, I desire the author. I need this figure, which is neither their representation nor the projection, as they need mine. So there's an awareness in the creation of the object by the author that there is going to be that relationship established, whether it's a poem or whether it's a text of some sort or an object, right? Whatever that object may be. But he's implying that the fetish or the fetishization of the object is partly the responsibility of the author, but also partly the responsibility of us to be drawn to that object in the first place. So again, this very dialectical, dynamic relationship between these objects, which are certainly worth considering. The last couple ones here, and because these are all coming from this book, The Modern. Okay. Yes. Okay, so pleasure finding, which again is really at the core of your thoughts. The pleasure of the sentence to a high degree is cultural. The artifact created by rhetoricians, grammarians, linguists, teachers, writers. This artifact is mimicked in a more or less ludic fashion, right? In the sense of pleasure, ludic is playful as well. We are playing with an exceptional object whose paradox has been articulated by linguistics. Now, the paradox with the object here, it's to be viewed, it's to be enjoyed as a piece of art, but sometimes we're just compelled to just pick it up because it feels good. So it is immutably structured and yet indefinitely renewable, something like chess. That's Barthes sort of thinking out loud. He talks about the pleasure of the text. classics, culture, intelligence, irony, delicacy, euphoria, mastery, security. All these things are conjured up in the viewer, or in the reader in this case, when they are reading the classics that are presented to them. Art of living. The pleasure of the text can be defined by praxis, the time and place of reading, the house, the countryside, near mealtime, the lamp, families who should be there. So the act of reading conjures up a certain time and place, a relationship with the world, a relationship with others. This pleasure can be spoken whence criticism, and the text of pleasure, pleasure in pieces, language in pieces, culture in pieces. Some texts are perverse in that they are outside any imaginary finality. I would say the cuddly object fits right there. Such texts or such objects are perverse in that they're outside of any imaginary finality. This object can continue to give pleasure, right? Even that of pleasure, bliss does not constrain our pleasure. It can even be apparently inflicting boredom. No alibi stands up, nothing is reconstituted, nothing recuperated. The text of the bliss is absolutely intransitive, right? Relational to one another, to the subject and the object. However, perversion does not suffice to define bliss. It is the extreme of perversion which defines it. An extreme, continually shifted, empty, mobile, unpredictable extreme. This extreme guarantees bliss. An average perversion quickly loads itself up with a play of subordinating finalities, prestige, ostentatious, rivalry, lecturing, and so on. So what he's describing is, in the pleasure of the text, all the different mental and emotional faculties that are conjured up in the act of reading, the pleasure of reading, considering the author, considering the time and place in which it was written. Is it a clandestine piece of information that was suppressed for years and now we have it in our hands? Was it something that a person enjoyed, a travel log? Whatever it is, that object can be, in a multitude of ways, very pleasurable. So the reason why I wanted to point that out is the way in which Barth can, even if we don't agree with him all the time, can kind of open up ways of thinking and ways of seeing that object from a different perspective. I just thought that those particular ideas were at least worth considering, because Barth, yes, is talking about language and talking about literature and poetry. That was his prime thing. But I think some of the ideas, maybe some of the poetics, right, that he presents to us, some might be relevant and useful more so than others. But I just thought that those things I wanted to present to you. I know I've done lots of talking. We've recorded this, so you can kind of go back. But as many of these as I can, I'll send to you as links for you to kind of go back. And if you're not sure where those pieces are, that's why I was reading the page numbers, so you can at least go through them. But here's what I would do. I would bring it up as a text and use the magnifying finder up in the top corner and just put in random words like emotion, enjoyment, words that might be part of your poetic, and just see what comes up. Because even in aesthetic theory, Adorno talks about things that are considered ugly, and he considers them really important because they do break that mold, that capitalist mold of aesthetic, contemplation that leads to consumption. Something ugly kind of breaks that very sort of rigid relationship that we have, right? It tries to go beyond it. So are those things that might be helpful in sort of organizing, I was going to say situating, but organizing your ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually feeling a bit constrained as I was doing my research over the past week. When I was reading, when I was reading those things, I almost feel that there's nothing I could talk about. Like there's nothing really new, but I was your suggestions are constantly provokes ideas in me. I'm thinking about how cuteness be like educated? Can we be taught to feel something cute? That would be
Mm,
an interesting aspect. I think I would find some answers of that to that question in Barth or in Adorno, that's something new I would really want to look at, and
Okay.
how that connects to. Sorry, there's another idea in my mind. Yes, and I was thinking about another book that I was reading, on. I'm not sure if it's maybe just a bit relevant. It's by Azuma. I don't remember. I could send it to you afterward. It talks
Oh,
about,
okay. Yeah.
yeah, it's, I think the title is Database Animal. It talks about how in Japanese animations, different kinds of like categories of, mostly pretty girls are being built, so
Mhm.
that when we are looking at certain characters, we're not only looking at these characters, but the whole, we are automatically associate some characters, some characteristics of this character with a larger database of all
Yeah.
different kinds of attributes, which are essentially connected to cute, beautiful, and all that. Um, yeah, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about uh, Adorno's trigger words. It's probably not the precise word that he used, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's very
But
interesting. Now I'm
yeah, I was going to say
really.
I was using that more as a comparison
Mhm.
that certain objects may trigger those emotional responses, and of course for Adorno that is really important because anything that breaks that veneer, and again, Debord called it the spectacle. Anything that breaks that spectacle and reintroduces the subject into the relationship established between the means ends relationship of a piece of art, right? It isn't just to be sold. It's to be thought about. It's to be returned to. And why else have a museum? I mean, you can hang all kinds of art in there, but what's the purpose of art other than to be sold? No, it should do more than that. But I think you're looking at a very particular type of art that conjures up a specific feeling, and they kind of like, oh, when you see something that's really cute. And it turns out, surprise, there actually is a chapter in a book which I'll send you the link to, that literally says like that oh moment. And it asks like, why is that happening? Why is it that a certain thing, it conjures up something in that person? They're thinking about that object, but are they in that present moment right there? Are they experiencing it in the nowness, or are they feeling this way because it's now brought back a childhood memory? These ideas that Adorno had, I would say, just for fun, when you get to the aesthetic theory PDF, type in the word childhood and just see how many times he says it, because it's something that he returns to. I mean, just a few quotes that I read, they're quite striking, because when I was looking for things to sort of to add into the mix, I was surprised at how often he used that image, right, of that childish wonder, childlike wonder, not childish. See how many times he mentions that, because there's something in this aesthetic of cuteness that really sort of lends itself nicely to thinking back to to a better time of childhood, where we can sort of step out of the nowness of our lives into something that was in the past that we were lucky enough to experience and we can draw from. And I think that poetics of cuteness, I think, is that might be an important component of it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you links to all these things, and then we'll set aside all the SI stuff for this week. I'm just going to send you all of this because that's a lot of material to go through. But what I also did is I found the article that you mentioned. Oh God, I've got a desk full of papers. But anyway, that I'm going to read through to see some of the ideas that you were considering. I found a couple of other articles too on the avant-garde and cuteness, which you may or may not know about. I'll send those as well. And then what I'm going to try to do is stay on the same track as you are. And so if you have anything that you have found, send me just even during the week. Oh, hey, this is the article I mentioned to you. But I'll send you links to all of these things, rather than the actual PDF. I'll send you the link, because in that way it's going to make a much smaller email, because if I send you the text, it's going to be like 20 or 20 megs and I can't send it to you. But anyway, all the links work because I picked them up this morning. And because of that, You can take a look at them at your leisure, and hopefully they will be helpful in some kind of way. I think it's the anti-aesthetic, the Hal Foster book, the Bart's book, the Adorno book, and I think also the Durkheim one. But I think Durkheim is only relevant in the sense that, you know, what he called a social fact, we could also call the spectacle. We can call it capitalist culture. At that time, what he described was already there at play. And of course, he talked about alienation as social enemy, the disconnectedness people have from each other, you know, from their backgrounds, their religious background, their family background. And I don't know if that's something you wish to consider, that maybe, you know, living far away somewhere else, disconnected from your geographical history, if sometimes finding something in a store or an art gallery that reminds you of your childhood, if it has a deeper impact because it's something that is in your present life so far away, right? The other side of the world, or something that's long gone. There's a lot of psychological issues too that I think might be part of that. I'm going to take a look in just my like my psych books, and I don't want to get completely Freudian or Lacanian on you, because I think that may take us in different directions. But I think just in a general way, because what we're talking about here are what Freud and what others have called affective relationships, not effective, but affective, because they come from within, and often the vehicle that expresses them are emotions. So I think there may be something in affective relationships that may be something that you might want to consider. I'll look into that, and I'll set up just a little thing for next week. But for this week, at least, I'm going to read the material that I found and have sent to you, a little bit more detail, and we'll just kind of carry on. We'll keep working on shaping this the report for this class. Now, in the meantime, I'll look to see whether there are some SI material that might be relevant to this, and then we'll keep it much more focused that way, because there are some ideas that match up really nicely, this idea of subjectivity, radical subjectivity, and so on, but other things that perhaps are a little bit too political, that maybe are taking us in the wrong direction, or at least in a different direction. So I'll go through what I would have set up, now be much more particular with what I'm going to link to the email. But for sure, I'll send you links to all the things that I showed you from this morning, and in that way you've got the material to look at. But for sure, use that little finder up top. I love using those things because they save a lot of time, and also too to see just how many times certain words get used, because that can become a kind of poetics. If there's a return to the same idea over and over again, slightly different shape, slightly different context, but the same idea keeps recurring, that could be something that you could work into your poetics as well. Anything else?
Thank you very much. I found out that a book that I referred to, the Sion Gaze, our
Yeah.
aesthetic categories, was out of the library at Western. I happen to have a PDF
Oh,
of it. If you would like,
okay.
I can send it to you.
I think I may have found it. We may be talking about the same book, but send me the link, and I'm going to see whether it's the same thing, because the original article that you had mentioned. Okay, so this is original stuff. Yes, the cuteness of the avant-garde. I found a copy of that. The critical inquiry. The Richard Rorty things I don't know, but I certainly have the Linda Hutchins book. But the other one, the one you just mentioned, if you do have a PDF of it, for sure, I'd like to have a look at it, and then that way we can both be reading the same material, and we can discuss that in more detail.
Yeah, I think the cuteness of avant-garde is actually also included in that book as a chapter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
So,
so is that the retrofuturism of cuteness? Wan Chung Kao and Jen Boyle? Is that
no, it's by the same author. I think it's
okay?
a collection of his essay called Our Aesthetic Categories: the
Okay.
cuteness, the interesting, and the zany. So she explored these three aesthetic categories in that book.
Okay.
Um,
Perfect. Perfect. Because that really is going to give you a good grounding in the next direction you want to take. So what I'll do is I'm going to download. No, should I do that? Because I found it. I found it actually in the digital library. What I might try to do is send them over the next couple of days. But the book, The Retrofuturism of Cuteness, is broken down into chapters. So I'll send you a couple of the chapters, see if it's useful, and let me know, and then I can send you the rest. But all the rest of the books that I've talked about today will just be links, so it won't be a huge, like I say, a huge email. But in the meantime, I'm going to read The Cuteness of the Avant-Garde, because that sounds like a really interesting idea, and I'd never thought of it. But it literally took me a couple of hours to just go through my library and go, yeah, this works, and this works, and this is relevant, this is important. So I'm looking forward to working with you on this to really shape it in something interesting, because I think it's a very new field. So ideas are still being generated. Like there isn't a kind of not a praxis, but a kind of a template, right? The template to me doesn't seem to have been finalized. Whoever it is that is writing about it, there seems to be a very open field, and different ideas are being welcomed into it. So it's absolutely the right time to be writing about it.
Yeah, and yes, that's also the kind of I think it's the question I have on writing about the poetic of cuteness when I was go back to read the interviews of all those authors or
Mhm.
replaying their games. Um, and trying to connect the theory and practice of cuteness.
Yeah.
It's actually I don't want to say because, but well, there is the impression that the cuteness theories is something very new, and what the avant-garde queer cute video game makers they're more making the games out of their intuition, or they will usually say, well, I just like it in this way, I
Mhm.
draw in this way. I'm not sure if I could follow, well, at least the Linda Houston's um, the poetics as a framework.
Mhm.
Um, well, for postmodernism, this is something entirely different.
Yeah.
Well, the theories are already integrated with the practice, and they're like all self-critical and self-conscious. But with the poetic of cuteness, I find it a bit more difficult to do this way. Both seems to be not yet
Mhm.
incorporated into each other yet.
Okay.
Um,
I think with the Hutchins book, if you just look at the opening chapter, she kind of lays out that framework. And I would say as you read through it, just kind of like one line, it's this, 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 and then have a look at it and say, well, how close could my, poetics of cuteness fit within it? And again, you don't want to reproduce exactly the same thing, but what you want to do is have a look at it and say, okay, she has set it up in this way because the content that she wishes to examine really lends itself to this sort of a framework. Those might be the questions you want to ask yourself as you kind of go through and try to map out what this thing actually looks like, because it is a poetics that she does define in the opening chapter. But I wouldn't make it something you have to adhere to 100%. It's basically a model, right? So you're doing a kind of model theory, and like this person's done a poetics of postmodernism. I'm going to do a poetics of cuteness. How was this one structured and put together? What can I import into mine that will look similar, or at least address the issue in the same substantial way? I'll do the same thing. I'm going to go through that opening chapter again, because it's been a few years since I read it. I think I bought it when it first came out, but I'm going to go back again and just try to do that and see if I can sort of map out that very flexible framework that she has, because the very nature of postmodernism lends itself to a fluid, dynamic, flexible kind of framework, because that seems to be the nature of the work that people are doing today, that allows us to examine it in the first place and identify something that is postmodern versus not. Here you're trying to identify what is cute versus what is not. What is the essence of it? And so all those things I think we'll discuss more next week, but I'm going to go through the material that you've given me. I'm going to go through the first chapter of the Hutchins book, and see if we can sort of set up something that we can work with for next week.
maybe not the Richard Rorty's paper. I don't find them relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know much about the field, and I just made a mistake wasting some time reading those. So,
Mhm. Well, and I tend to read a lot of different things, and even if I disagree with them, they get me
mhm.
thinking. And because the question becomes, well, why do I disagree with it? Oh, because of this. Oh, now we're moving forward. It's surprising. I mean, as much as Durkheim is not looked at, by the left and very favorably, I still think he's relevant. I still think he's worth reading because what he does is he sets a foundation that from which you can begin working and thinking again, even by way of criticism. To ignore people like that is really at our peril, and we end up, not being good theorists if we're not at least aware of things that are considered differently, right? The same topic, just considered differently. Nothing wrong with that. Anyway, listen, I'll let you go if that's okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this video. I'm probably going to wait till tomorrow to send this email with everything, because I'll send a link to this video as well. And then if you want to go back and review it, I'll just set it up on YouTube and it'll just be for public viewing. I don't think anyone is going to see it. It doesn't matter, but you and I know it's there, right? That's the most important thing. Anyway, I'm glad you're feeling better. I'm hoping I'm going to be feeling better as well. The next week, I won't be coughing every 5 minutes, but trust me, I sound better than I did even a couple of days ago, because I actually had to cancel classes because I was feeling that bad. So now I'm feeling a little bit better. And by next week, I should be fantastic. All
Thank you.
right.
Hope you
So,
get better soon.
okay. So take
Mm.
good care of yourself, and we'll see
Mm.
each other next week.
See you
All right.
next week.
Bye
Mm.
bye.